Hello, space friends! What you're seeing here is a version of the Enterprise that I would have liked to see on modern television, perhaps in Star Trek Discovery. I created this model to demonstrate how the original Enterprise design never really needed to be changed that much to appear glorious. Enhanced and augmented, yes, but radically changed, no. In this video, I'll justify my thinking as I show you how I enhanced the ship using 3D software. The original Enterprise has been changed many times. The very first Starship Enterprise from the pilot episode The Cage was changed soon after for the next pilot for the TV show Where No Man Has Gone Before, and then once more when the original series hit its stride. These were very minor changes to the bridge, the running beacons, back of the nacelles, and the dish size. These are things that most fans would hardly ever notice. Of course, it did receive a major visual overhaul, an upgrade for the first movie in 1979, Star Trek the Motion Picture, which remains today one of the favorite versions among hardcore Trek fans. In the Star Trek 2009 movie, the design of the Enterprise saw a major departure from the original or even the motion picture version. Most Trek fanatics didn't really approve of what seemed like an arbitrary change to an already perfect design. And although I myself don't dislike the 2009 version, I also believe this change was unnecessarily extravagant. Besides, it's still not as good as the original. And then in 2018, the Enterprise shows up again in the Star Trek Discovery series. And yes, it's a little bit closer to the original, but it isn't the original. The colors are much darker, the proportions are different, the bridge has a window, the warp nacelle pylons are swept back like in the motion picture, even though this show takes place about 25 years before the motion picture, among several other differences. Now again, just like the 2009 version, I don't dislike this Discovery version of the Enterprise. In fact, I really applaud the artists, for these changes are often by the command of their bosses and producers, but these seemingly arbitrary changes break the immersion in the universe for hardcore fans and Starship connoisseurs like myself. Now, of course, let's be realistic. If the Enterprise is to appear in several scenes for modern television, and it does, a 1960s version just wouldn't look right while flying next to the Discovery. I get that. However, the original Enterprise can be enhanced and augmented in a way to compete with minimum changes, and that is exactly what I've done here with this 3D model. Now, I'm not the first to do this. There were many great concepts even before the Star Trek 2009 movie was released that didn't have these radical departures from the original version. You can do this in a way to imply that most of these visual enhancements were always there. It's just that the film quality of the 1960s never really allowed you to see it. Now, this is a very fast breakdown of this redesign, not a 3D modeling tutorial. First of all, I'm using Blender 3D for all my modeling and shaders. It's free, and it can now do just about all the things an expensive studio quality 3D program can do. I had this old Constitution-class Starship model collecting dust as a digital asset in my hard drive. I had used it before in my Balance of Terror Battle Breakdown video, Enterprise Size video, and the 4 Years War videos. It was a relatively simple model with lower quality shaders, so I selected this as the foundation to work from. We'll start with the saucer. I made a few tweaks to make the thickness of my saucer more like the original, added a little bump texturing to the edges, but of course the biggest enhancement is a specular hull plating, or Aztecing, a technique devised and still done best for Star Trek the Motion Picture. This plating can't just be thrown up onto your texture any which way for the best effect. To look truly awesome, taking the time to place each plate element strategically and artfully will always yield the best results. The lower dome in the original was just a big glowing dome. However, it always bothered me that in the original version, the phasers and photon torpedoes seemed to come from this. So instead I modeled an assembly that had plates for phasers and torpedo tubes. I would add these phaser emitters a little later. I also more dynamically lit the sensor dome, which would also be the source for floodlighting that would light up the NCC numbers on the saucer. For the upper decks below the bridge, I also added these phaser platforms. I then skipped the bridge and set about devising how to do the Bassard ram scoops on the warp nacelles. Mine were primitive compared to the truly amazing effect on the original Enterprise. To achieve this, I made the dome caps translucent and made a rotating impeller with a lot of lights behind it. I would later spin this in a looping animation. Initial tests were kind of off, so I simply added a counter-rotating impeller in there, and this gave me a pretty close imitation of the original effect. Oh yes, these ram scoops have the antennas on them added, like the original pilot version of the Enterprise. A fan commented that he wanted them in one of the work-in-progress shots, so I added them. Much like the lower sensor dome, the bridge was slightly altered to show some more detailed lighting. I made little ball turrets for the phaser similar to the ones on the Motion Picture Enterprise and installed them in pairs on the 6 platforms I had made around the upper decks and lower dome. I then rebuilt the back of the nacelle, eliminating the balls in the back. I'm partial to the grilled holes look of the pilot version, and I could make those light up. I added a great deal more texture detail to the nacelles, and added a glow effect on the inner nacelle. This is in keeping with the idea of an energy field that passes between the warp nacelles that work in pairs. You know, as if it was always there in the original, you just never got to see it actually lit up. I also set up a little bit of illumination for the NCC numbers on the nacelles. Now, these fins on the nacelles are intercooling units. I added more detail by building sort of vents on each of them. These vents have a bit of a subtle red glowy things, as if they're venting heat and red hot. Then I set to the arduous task of fixing several modeling errors on the lower hull. After this was fixed, I added Aztec plating to the whole damn thing. Now in other 3D programs, I had floodlighting for the ship's text down, but for Blender, through arduous trial and error, I figured out the right settings for the floodlights that would illuminate the name and NCC numbers on the hull, which are mostly attached spotlights. Now a couple of notes. There were features between the pilot versions and the series versions that I both liked and disliked. As you can see, I went with this version of the impulse drive, a pilot version. I'm not sure which pilot. This is perhaps an earlier model impulse drive with 7 individual thrust nozzles. It's not something we've seen in modern Trek, so I went with that. The pilot version also had a larger dish, which I just couldn't stomach. Creative liberty here, I really prefer the smaller dish. Also on the dish, I added a little bit more glow lighting and a little bit more bump texture. Also, almost forgot on the main hull, there's these glowy lights around the edge of the dish area. Not too much or so much to make it like the motion picture version, but just enough. The pilot version also had 2 darker strips on the top of the saucer, which I threw out. I prefer mostly a clean and uniform color for the saucer, sometimes less is more. It also had more pinstripes, so I kept some of those. Now one thing about the navigation and running lights, which the Discovery version had none when it first appeared, is that they give the ship a little bit more life, not unlike a heartbeat. I put some kind of nav lights on almost all of the ships I model. On both the pilot and series versions, there are 2 pairs of nav beacons on the top of the saucer, one large and one small, green to starboard, and one large and one small, red to port. I really prefer just 1 light to port and 1 to starboard. Thanks to a fan comment on the preview shots, I followed the nautical and aerial navigation standards. The red to port, starboard to green, and white to aft lights are all solid. Blinking collision lights on the top and the bottom, and finally white strobe lights on the nacelles. I believe I will have a version of this model in Sketchfab by the time this video releases, if you want to interact with the model yourself, which will be linked in the description below. I will also have full-size still shots on this image at the website resurrectedstarships.com, also linked in the description. There you can find all my Starship videos with images and stats in an organized, consumable format. I plan to use this model for my next video, which will outline the rules for designing a Starfleet ship. Oh yes, there are rules for designing Starfleet ships, originally laid out by Gene Roddenberry himself and crystallized by Andrew Probert. Of course, they are broken regularly, but this is world building. The discipline to create within a stylistic structure often yields the best results. Also, I regularly post early access videos or full-size progress images for patrons who support this channel at patreon.com/resurrected. Click it in the description. Patreon support helps me to spend more time creating higher quality videos rather than simple low quality videos. I prefer to stay away from making clickbait. And special thanks to the following new patrons on Patreon: Luis Panadero Gardeno, JHB, Von Tux, and Robert Kreutzer. Until next time, space friends.